Welcome everyone to this roundtable happening in the Virtual Ocean Pavilion, titled Women and Oceans: Context, Challenges and a Case Study. Women's and Oceans is a topic now receiving greater attention in multiple international spaces. The renewed attention notwithstanding, women continue to face gender disparities within ocean sectors. This impacts on their ability to participate in ocean science, law, governance, and the sustainable economic development of the oceans. There are projects around the world to advance gender equity, including women's knowledge and decision-making, and to encourage women's involvement in mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change in the oceans. Today's roundtable will feature 3 speakers who will provide interventions on the context of women and oceans, challenges within maritime sectors, and a case study on small-scale fisheries in Ghana. My name is Fiona Pelham. I'm CEO of Positive Impact. And during COP29, we've been powering the Pavilion for People, which exists so all voices can be heard in the important conversations of our time. It's my role today to keep our schedule and facilitate questions so that everyone can have an opportunity to ask questions before the closing with critical reflection. So to start today, let's explore who we have participating with us. Let me first ask, do we have any visitors here with us today who would like to share their name, their title, and the institute they represent? And following that, I will introduce the speakers. Thanks, Sheila.
Hi, everybody. Sheila Heymans, I'm the Executive Director of the European Marine Board, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks for being with us, Sheila. Who else is a guest who is able to introduce themselves? And Sheila did a great example there of just raising her hand. And when we come to the question section later on today, we'll use the raised hand feature. Kim or Nancy, would you like to introduce yourself? Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. My name is Katie Mitchell. I'm a research assistant with the Global Ocean Forum, which is one of the co-organizers of the Virtual Ocean Pavilion this year.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie.
Hello,
Nancy.
everyone. My name is Nancy Burmas. From the Philippines, I'm with the Partnerships in Environmental Management for the Seas of East Asia, currently managing an integrated river basin management project involving 6 ASEAN member states.
Thanks for being with us, Nancy. And Miriam, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Fiona. I'm a participant today. I'm an attendee, so I didn't realize I have to introduce myself. So I'm Miriam Bagos. I'm with the Global Ocean Forum, co-organizer of the Virtual Ocean Pavilion. Lovely to see all of you here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. And then Kim sent a message because she has a microphone problem. So saying that she's an independent ocean law specialist and a member of IUCN-WCEL. And it maybe is a bit unusual to introduce the guests before the speakers, but I hope that gives the speakers an understanding of who their audience is, which is always nice. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Bernadette Snow, who is a senior marine social scientist from the Scottish Association for Marine Science. Bernadette, over to you.
Thank you, Fiona, and welcome everyone. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So I'm going to keep my intervention as short and sweet as possible. So Fiona has mentioned already some of this is a global issue that we are looking at. And I think we also need to understand that it's quite complex, the role of gender and gender within the ocean space, and that it is a social construct. In other words, it means that we construct the way we identify or speak about and include gender in how we undertake different economic interventions or how we speak about gender in the space. And also, I think one of the most important things for us to think about in our discussion is that we're not homogenous. Gender is not the same. So what's really important and what is growing is also looking at the intersectionality within gender. And by this, it sounds like a big word and quite complex, and you might have to go Google it quickly, but it's looking at also the role of things like gender, ethnicity, class, culture play. And it's this intersectionality as well that brings a lot of this discrimination or privileges even within the gender space. So it's not all gender is discriminated equally if we bring in some of these other aspects that we need to look at as well. We also need to understand that gender is not talking about sex. It's also not always talking about gender as a binary construct or a binary way of speaking, but it's also identifying that there is a non-binary aspect around the gender conversation that we need to take into account. And when we do this, context matters as well, because often non-binary, so not women and men, binary identification within the gender, is seen as illegal or not accepted in many parts of the world. So we always have to take this complexity into account. However, if we do focus on women and girls, so even within our human rights, most human rights treaties do look at equality and equity within women and girls in particular as a focus. However, there is, even though it's in most, it's not in all treaties. And globally, there are still millions of women and girls that are subjected to discrimination, in particular, gender-based violence and denied dignity and equality, if we talk about these things. I'm going to focus a little bit just on culture and gender, because these are very closely intertwined, and this will become more clear why I focus on just mentioning, this connectivity between them when Bola comes on a little bit later talking about the case study. But they really look at how it behaves, the behavior towards different genders within the ocean space, and often these constructs, the cultural way of gender identification and gender inclusion is really important in keeping social cohesion and how then women are included in, say, blue economies. However, if we look historically, looking at it from a feminist approach, even though I think many of us may not think of it as a feminist approach or an ecofeminist approach, is that women play an extremely important role in sustainability. And they play a very important role in seeing things in a broader space as a commons, as a community. And it's this gendered approach that we really need if we're going to tackle things like climate change and any of the other really critical, wicked problems or complex problems that we need to do. So women have and are and continue to play a critical role in our sustainable development agenda. And I think it's just identifying this, then finding ways and solutions for these challenges and involvement within the marine sector is going to be really important. And that's why I think it would be very good for Eugenia to come next, Fiona.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Bernadette. And yes, let's just pass straight to Eugenia. Miss Eugenia Morayo, Senior Environmental Economist, Natural Capital Solutions. And Eugenia, please pronounce your name first before we start, because I'm not sure that I managed that.
No, you did quite well. Eugenia, yes, sounded great. So yeah, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be here as well. And I'm gonna give you a quick overview on women's roles and challenges within the ocean sectors. And I'm particularly going to focus on fisheries, maritime transport, and also just mentioning ocean research, science research as well. So we know that both women and men participate and actively contribute to the ocean sectors. but they do so many times taking on different roles and facing different challenges, defined, for example, by the domestic and family responsibilities, social norms and expectations, also their access to finance and training opportunities. In fisheries, where I'm going to start with, women's work is getting more and more recognized over time, but is still many times invisible and seen as family help, although it's fundamental, as Bernadette said as well, to sustain their communities. They catch, process, and sell fish, so they do everything. However, their wages are lower than men's and their jobs more precarious, and many times they are informal or part-time. They may not be able to travel to bigger markets to sell their fish if lack transport or need to stay close to home to care for their children. It's harder as well for them to access finance, as many times they don't own land or other assets, and have less time than men to attend trainings and project meetings. Decision-making power in their families and communities is mainly in the hands of men. Therefore, their needs and priorities are hardly considered in policymaking. In another ocean sector, maritime transport, an increasing number of women are taking on roles traditionally considered masculine. For example, working as seafarers. Like in the case of fisheries, however, women's jobs are generally lower paid and are found in very limited numbers in management positions. While most women in the sector occupy onshore roles, women who work as crew members and officers on boats find, for example, that they don't have access to the facilities they may require as women. And their abilities and competence are often doubted. They may even be considered as a source of trouble. Also, women in the sector are exposed to harassment and discrimination, including sexual harassment. And in ocean science research, while we can find similar numbers of women and men enrolled in the bachelor and master programs, the gender differences are more obvious in later career stages, when women occupy less senior positions and are more likely to have a precarious job. Also, they find it harder than men to get research funding. While women attend ocean research conferences around the world in similar numbers to men, they are not invited as keynote speakers in the same proportion. Like in the other sectors mentioned, women are less represented in leadership and decision-making roles, and are likely to turn down work and research opportunities abroad to take care of their families. Sexual harassment and discrimination are again present for these women too. To summarize, among the main challenges and barriers for women in ocean sectors are the following. They lack access to finance, likely due to, they don't own land at the same scale as men, and they earn lower wages. And also access to other resources like equipment, transport, or technology. As I said, they earn lower wages and their jobs tend to be more informal, so they may have less access to social protection. They are underrepresented in management and decision-making, and also they work more hours a day than men when including domestic work. So women have less time for training and education or to participate in community meetings, for example. And also stereotypes that Bernadette mentioned as well, the cultural aspects that considers, for example, in the case of fisheries, but also the ocean at large, is still seen as a male domain. So many times when women work on board or they are trainers, they are asked, what are you doing here? And again, as I said before, they are also at risk of violence or harassment, including discrimination in the workplace. And to finish, it's important to keep in mind as well that local context matters. Gender dynamics are very contextual and keep changing over time. And again, as Bernadette said earlier, other characteristics in addition to gender, like race and ethnicity, age, or social class, are going to further define people's access to resources and decision making, and ultimately the particular challenges they face and also the opportunities they can enjoy. And that's it. Happy as well to talk more about it in the discussion later or with any questions.
Thank you very much, Eugenia. And I'm now very happy to introduce Dr. Bolanle Iranosho, Senior Lecturer, School of Law, University of Derby.
Thank you, Fiona. Hello, everyone. So following on from the context and the challenges and opportunities that have been discussed, what I would just like to quickly highlight is an example of where many of what has been highlighted does play out. And then I will finish off by talking briefly about some of the activities we're doing to try to remedy those challenges. Okay, so I will focus more on the activities and perhaps less on the challenges because they, to be honest, mirror exactly what has been said. Over the last few years, we have been doing a lot of research work in Ghana. For those who perhaps are not familiar with Ghana, Ghana is a country along the West African coast, bordering the Atlantic Ocean, and it has over 500 kilometers of coastline. So marine fisheries are a very, very strong component of the blue economy in that space. However, marine fisheries in particular, have a very long history along the coast dating back over 300 years or more. And so it is very, very much tied into the culture of the people. It is very much tied to their identity as coastal peoples and coastal dwellers. And small-scale fishers are perhaps the largest population of fishers in the country, as well as largest contributor to the fishing industry in Ghana. Now, small-scale fisher women are obviously a huge component of that because a lot of the fishing is often very kin-based and family-based, which means women will be very much a part of it. However, it has been highlighted by the previous speakers, this has not necessarily, that value and that contribution has not necessarily been properly recognized in the past. And the reason for that is multifold, but I think the biggest one is because fishing activities in Ghana is along gender lines, and that is very much embedded into the culture and the tradition of the people now. And so there are strong cultural norms that potentially forbid women from going to sea. Which then means that a lot of the fishing activities are carried out by the men. So the men will go to the sea, the women will engage in the pre-harvest, that is everything in preparation to go into the sea. And of course, when the harvest comes in, they will engage in post-harvest, including the selling and marketing of the fish. Now, which therefore meant that because of those strong gender lines, there has been a lot of exclusion of the women from decision making, as has been mentioned, as well as this has often also reflected in the law itself, which is very interesting. So the legal framework that underpins fishing in Ghana does not do enough to sufficiently recognize the contribution of women, and in particular women small-scale fishers. And so as an example, in terms of the management of fisheries, it creates a fisheries board, but on that board, the representation for small-scale fishers is limited to about one person, but that small-scale fisher will also be a man. So you have a situation where even though all small-scale fishers are perhaps disadvantaged in terms of representation, the women are even more disadvantaged in that space. And so you have the research we have done after speaking to women across the regions where fishing is conducted, there is a very strong sense of that exclusion from decision-making spaces, the exclusion from the law, exclusion from even financial benefits. And so subsidies, fishing subsidies, the biggest of them, for example, is fuel for the vessels. And so if the women are not going to sea, they don't get the fuel for the vessels, which is another practical example of how they're excluded. So you get multiple examples of those challenges in that space. Now, because it's also very much connected to the culture of the people, it means that any intervention that is proposed has to be very carefully deployed to recognize that dynamic and to recognize the strong culture and identity, which is also very much tied to the religion as well. So what did we do to kind of quickly summarize? Well, because we're lawyers, our approach really was to examine what, yes, there are challenges in the law, but what also are the opportunities in the law to be able to support those communities of women. Now, one of the ways and one of the opportunities we identified was to use the human rights framing to support those women. Now, we chose the human rights framing because, as with many countries in that part of the world, human rights are very much strongly embedded in the constitutions of those countries. And there are perhaps arguably more developed part of the law than some others, and it's easier to enforce in the sense that because these are strong constitutional obligations, there are many more opportunities already inherent to be able to enforce those obligations. Of course, there are challenges with human rights which we recognize, but it does create significant opportunities. And so it was the idea that if we're able to use a human rights framing to support the women, then perhaps there will be opportunities to engage more and overcome some of those challenges. But to be able to do that, the women had to be able to see their challenges within a human rights framing. And so the first thing we then did was to organize what we call human rights education workshops across the regions for those women. Doing that was also a learning experience in itself, because that also meant you had to be careful of the culture. You know, the language of human rights can also be challenging vis-a-vis the culture. And so you had to find the balance with that. And so we organized a few of those workshops, which the women who participated thoroughly engaged with this, and I think they benefited from it. In addition to that, it was also supporting the women through what we call legal pop-ups clinics. And so those clinics, which were offering legal advice to the women, were also an opportunity to engage with the law and see where the opportunities are within the law. Now, the point of all of this, so without going into too much detail of the activities, I think what I'd like to say is that the women who have participated across the coast very much enjoyed and benefited from it. But ultimately, I think our biggest aim, and which is, I think, the one final point I want to make, is that it's always important, and the women have reflected that in continually developing their organizational capacity and continually strengthening their networks. And so the one thing we always wanted to do was to make sure that all of this work was very much steeped in the networks and the organizational systems that the women had already started to establish. And what we quickly saw was that by doing it that way, the women were definitely more empowered to engage with those structures. And I think we can see from the research that is going on how much they have been able to definitely contribute to, as Bernie would say, to sustainably managing the ocean space. And they are indeed at the forefront of that, I would say, now in Ghana. And so I'll kind of leave it here, and I can talk a bit more about what we've done in Ghana for those who are interested in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bolanle. That was fantastic. So I'd now like to open the floor for questions. I'm sure you're all familiar with Zoom, so you know that you can raise your hand, but we're also a small group, so if you want to just raise your hand this way, we can also do that. What questions do you all have? Or comments? So while you think on one, oh, Miriam, yes.
This is a question for, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, Bolanle. It's, I think, a question to that last point that you raised. I'm wondering if you can explain to us how you manage with attribution of the enhancements in the situation of women to the work that you are doing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, we're not suggesting that all of the enhancements are attributed to the work that we do. But what we have found over the time, so the women have been, I should say, even before we started to work with them, they had started to organize themselves. So they do for over 20 years or so now. They have come together in organizations through what we call associations of fish processors and traders to come together as a collective to try to articulate some of their challenges and also to see if they can advocate for more inclusion. And so our aim really was to keep supporting what they already had started to do by giving them all of these extra opportunities by saying, well, yes, advocacy is great, but do you also know, for example, that there is already opportunities within the law which we think you should be able to explore to also keep pushing it and saying, these are, there are participatory rights which are already inherent in the law. Why is this not being done? So it was adding on an extra layer to the work that they are already doing. Now, as to the practical effects of it. So, for example, our research has shown that the women are a bit more empowered in terms of one of the big problems we have in Ghana is illegal and IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and particularly in terms of the fishing methods, so using chemicals to fish and fishing with dynamite and things like that. And in the past, the women perhaps have felt helpless in engaging with it. But more recently, more and more of the women are saying that, well, we're much more clear on our power to be able to decline to sell these kinds of fish. And so for us, it's those kinds of feedback that helps us to understand that perhaps, the information we're giving and those kinds of strategies we're deploying perhaps yielding, some efforts. But I think ultimately, until we perhaps get a change in the law, maybe that will be a more tangible evidence, but we're not there yet. But we keep pushing and we keep, advocating and, pointing that out to government.
Thank you. And I can ask a question now to each of the speakers. You've all mentioned the importance of cultural norms. Could you share an example of a cultural norm that you've seen that's working positively? And that could be, if you can't think of one, it could be one that you would like to see or hope to see in the future. So Bernadette, could we start with you?
Sorry, I'm just also noticing questions coming up in the chat and then trying to think of a response.
Okay, great. I will look at the chat and those in.
Yeah, it just popped up and I got sidetracked. Sorry, everyone. So how do I see it working positively in terms of culture?
Working on a research vessel can be very intense.
I guess, sorry, I think Devdata's got a question coming.
Do you have a question, Devdata? No, you can continue, Bernadette.
Okay. So I think it's really context specific and it's very hard. I can't think of an example or where it would work, because often one thinks that in some contexts, sort of Western contexts, that the culture allows therefore equity and for acceptance of different gender norms. However, some research has shown that this is not necessarily the case, and that women are still undervalued, and their contribution to the blue economy is not as clear even today. So for me, I think it would be very hard to give an example along those lines, because there are still discussions that are being given where women are still paid less or not necessarily in professorial roles in academia. In my experience and what I've seen and come across, I know that there are possibly examples of institutions that have been able to rectify this or work, in a targeted way along these lines. But then again, I want to guard against painting women as with a single brush, because of this intersectionality and because of not only culture, but also things like ethnicity plays a big role. I don't want to say sometimes it could be a double whammy for some women, so that they then also disadvantaged or discriminated against based on both their gender identity, but also on their ethnicity. And we've seen this going forward. And I think we still have a long way to go, which feeds into, I think, what Kim's question was around, well, how do we do this? It is so difficult. And I see Sheila's also got a hand up, so maybe she's got a good example to throw in there with a bit more positivity than what I've put across. But I think, in terms of with Kim's and that kind of sort of example, will be the movement for working together collectively. And I think what is positive is that we are surfacing the really important role that women play across the globe in the blue economy and in the sustainable development agenda. And I think what is very clear is that there have been these beacons or examples of women who have really pushed the envelope around the understanding of managing our commons and how to bring in a different approach within the ocean governance space. So which I think is really important. And I see Sheila's put a comment in which might actually feed in very well into this conversation there within the IOC.
Thanks, Bernadette. Sheila, would you like to input?
Yeah, sorry, I've been putting lots of things in the chat because there's lots of things that come to mind. Indeed, I kind of started off giving a comment on Eugenia. I think I'm not pronouncing your name right. The comment that you made about marine science. That's kind of my background. There is a international Oceanographic Commission Global Ocean Science Report, which is from 2020 now, but I think the next one will be coming out sometime next year, which really highlights the differences in gender in marine science. And it really shows that indeed, at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level, it's still okay. But as you go further up, by the time you get to professor, it's much worse. But even so, on average, I think in ocean science, it's something like 38% of people working in ocean sciences are female across the world. And then, of course, you have big differences in countries. So it's a big problem. It's not just a problem in the global south or anywhere. It is a big problem everywhere. It's a big problem. I think we had the I don't know what it's called in Europe, but in Europe, basically, sometime last week, was the date whereby women should stop working, because on average we only pay till then by year. So in, you know, the average salary of a woman and a man at the same level, we should have stopped working last week. Basically, for the work we're doing, we should, you know, we're not getting paid anymore. So there is a big problem on that, just in pay scales, but also just in how you would have parity just at a gender. And then there was also a question in the chat earlier about, you know, multiple issues, not just gender, but the others as well. And then I just, sorry, while I have the floor, I also put in the chat, Eugenia also mentioned issues with, so what's the word I'm looking for? Violence and things like that. There is a YouTube video that you should all watch. It's something that we brought out with the research National Research Council in the UK a few years ago under the Ocean Decade, which is about respect at sea, and it's all about issues that people have had on research vessels. And it's not just gender. There are other issues too, but it's mostly about gender. It's a very emotive video. Every time I watch it, I'm in tears. So totally watch it, but not right now. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Sheila, for that input. Would anyone else like to give an input following on from where Bernadette and Sheila have taken us in this conversation?
I could jump in here and maybe add on a slightly positive spin. Right. So, yes, there are big challenges with the culture around it. But I think for us, what we have seen is that the one good feature, I think, of many cultures, at least I speak from, you know, the West African space where we do a lot of our work, is that there is also very much inbuilt into the culture flexibility. You know, culture is very much subject to change, and it has indeed changed over so I say, for example, 300 years of fishing. It has changed over those 300 years of fishing. And in fact, perhaps some of the, arguably, the strongest barriers we have here are because of Western colonial experiences that then reformed the culture to reflect, you know, what was perhaps Christian Europe's approach. And so and it has changed, it continues to change with education, with, you know, religion, with social and economic challenges that has made, you know, change come sometimes or forces the change on them. And so that then creates opportunities even within the culture to adapt, to reflect and engage with those communities. So what we therefore are seeing is that in some spaces, and that point about not the gender framing not being homogeneous, I think plays out strongly in Ghana. So yes, there are lots of women who are excluded because they're not allowed to sea, but we're also seeing rising number of women owning vessels. And so yes, they may still not often be able to go out to sea, but they do have vessels now. And if they have vessels, then they're essentially controlling vast amounts of resources. So for women who are excluded, but there are also quite a number of them now who are owning vessels and being able to engage a bit more with it. And then also because of challenges like IUU fishing and all of the focus now being on women being change makers or agents of change, it has also created opportunities for the women to, you know, be a bit more assertive, I would say, in engaging with it and recognizing the power they have because they're very much in charge of the marketing, the pricing, and all of that. And what we do see is in that even in some communities, because of how their culture is very much women-centered, and I use the word very advisedly in the sense that the women tend to be the ones who are managing the resource. So I'll give an example. So in an area called Winneba, for example, the women often manage everything that has to do with the fishing, except going out to sea, which means that they very much control a lot of what gets done. And so even when they may not say it in public, because yes, they still have to pretend that the men are in control, once we dig a bit deeper, what we find is that actually the men don't even hold the cash, they hold nothing, the women hold everything. So you do see pockets of it. So it's not a blanket, I think, situation where all the women are disenfranchised. But I guess what we're still trying to do is get everyone to the same level. It's, I think, the challenge.
Thank you, Palonle. Eugenia, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just to add to that, in my experience as well, I've seen a lot of push for changes coming from the women. So I think sometimes when we talk about like gender, for example, fisheries, it seems like women are kind of in a passive spot, or we put them like in a passive spot, like they need our help. But many times it's just about not adding obstacles to the work that they are already doing or they are pushing for. I remember, for example, talking with the fishery officers that they were the first ones, like young women in Egypt, actually, that they had that very clear that this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to go on boats and be officers, and they had their education as well related to that, everything. They just wanted the support also from their families and then from their colleagues as well, their male colleagues, for example, in boats, etc. Not to make it harder for them. But I think there's a lot of movement, and many women also organizing themselves as well. And yeah, many times it's just those obstacles that, yeah, are put on them.
Thank you. That's a great contribution. Would anyone else like to add to this conversation, or are there any other questions that you'd like us to explore? I'll just have a look at the chat as well. Miriam?
I don't know how to phrase this question properly, but I'm going to ask it just the same. And if the experts can help me frame this in the best way that, in the proper way that it should be phrased. Has there been any assessment or any initiative in assessing how men could be supportive of the enhancement of the women's situation? Because it's like maybe a bit of a preaching to the choir and maybe a little bit more convincing for those who are getting in the way of bettering the situation of women. I don't know if I put myself across.
That's a fascinating question. And I think if you just look at all of us gathered here today, that question reflects the status quo that we can see. So of the lovely panelists, who would like to go first to respond to this? Give me a
I
hand
can
wave.
try,
Thank you.
but I opened it up to the rest of the floor, not just the panelists to respond. And it's a very good question in terms of preaching to the converted. Obviously, this is a topic of interest, and we're sitting here and, who are in the room and who are coming. So I think often around many of these discussions, what I've encountered is that in our attempt to have agency for women, men feel agency is taken away. And I think it's how we have those conversations is that we're not trying to create equality or equity through reversing the discrimination. And often the conversation comes around as we're now discriminating against men and then feel disempowered. And that's where I was saying that I think it's a collective issue that needs to be addressed. So what are the mechanisms and how do we have these conversations? And often it's really important to have the conversations in a way separate before you bring together, so that there are meaningful, and men are often excluded from these conversations. Even in research, we don't include men in our conversations even within some of our social science when we're working around ungendering or, gendered oceans. So I think one of the important thing would be is also having these meaningful conversations with men, as they have done with gender-based violence, where there are groups and men that are standing up against gender-based violence on women. And I think it's harnessing those conversations because, and then working contextually, it's also really important. So I think we can have these global or regional conversations and these global agendas of trying to foster equity. But a lot of the times, I think these conversations do have to take place in context, because the response to things like gender or to these different social norms and social politics is often seen as disempowering, and we mustn't go in disempowering. We have to go in that everyone has agency, and then what are the mechanisms to secure agency or increase agency. And that's also in response to what Eugenia is saying, is there are many women who have taken on the power, have taken on the agency, and should not be stopped in their process, but provided with more opportunities to then increase the number of women who have this agency. So it's not for women, it's not to improve women, it's we collectively can change the situation, and therefore it's that agency and power balance that has to be addressed. I hope that gives you some idea, Miriam.
If I can add to that quickly, just to say two things. I agree it's not about disempowering men, but of course, got to be considered that they would lose power, because if now they have all the power, they would need to share that. So there's always going to be resistance of it, no matter how you do. But yeah, I think it's good taking that into account, definitely, and involve them as well in the discussions. My second point is last year, I was in a project on gender and fisheries, and we interviewed men as well that were working in the sector. And we found two different, let's say, types of like thinking approaches from them. One, those that were very aware that women were working in the sector, of their contributions, that they needed to be supported as well. And another type that were denial, like there's no women working here. This is all like a men's space. And even when you bring them the data, well, actually there are women. They would say, oh, well, that's not really work. That's just them doing like part of their domestic responsibilities, let's say. So there's a lot of resistance still, even though I think, again, in some places more than others, probably it's changing. But yeah, there's resistance to even recognize that women contribute significantly in these sectors. So yeah, that was my contribution.
Thank you, Eugenia. That was very interesting. Yes, Nancy.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. Perhaps I can share our experience in Southeast Asia on how we are mainstreaming gender equality and social inclusion in our project activities. So, we look at how gender is mainstream at various levels of governance, from the commitment of the countries to the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, where majority of the ASEAN member states are signatory. And so these are translated at the ASEAN level into the ASEAN Declaration of the Advancement of Women in the ASEAN region. And more recently, there was the declaration on gender responsive implementation of the ASEAN Community Vision to 2025 and to the SDGs. And so these are like global and regional. And so at the national level, we also have across the ASEAN member states, national laws and legislations on how gender is mainstream into the national plans and programs. And so I think we're catching up in terms of creating the institutional arrangements at the national level, where, for instance, in Cambodia, which is mainly male-dominated, the spaces are male-dominated, they have created the Ministry of Women's Affairs. And of course, in the Philippines, we have the Philippine Commission on Women. And in Vietnam, this is a new development because the retirement age for women is 55, whereas for men, it's 60. And so they are now reviewing that, that policy of the government to create equal opportunities for both men and women, and increasing the retirement age to 65, because most of the women who reaches 55, they now have the necessary experience, and so they are more able to contribute to decision-making process and so on. And so at the river basin level, we're also looking into how this can be mainstream and looking at the gender equality and social context at the river basin level. And we did a gender analysis to look into the gender and social disparities in terms of river resource use, access, and control. We also look at the level of access to financing, to training and capacity development, and so on. And so I think in terms of the Global Environment Facility, we're also looking at how gender is being mainstream. Under GEF 6 programming, there was no requirement for us to report on gender participation in project implementation, whereas in GEF 7, and we are currently in under GEF 8, and so these are now required. And so in all of the project activities, gender has to be mainstream, and there is already a requirement that they have to have a gender specialist to look into all aspects of gender in all our project activities. So I think, so we're slowly catching up. And so, of course, we have all the necessary mechanisms and platforms to slowly mainstream. And so, yeah.
Thank
So
you,
we
Nancy.
hope that, yeah. So
Yeah.
we are required to report, of course, not just counting how many men and women participated in our project activities, but how they are influencing the decision-making process and how they are participating in capacity building and knowledge management. And in our office, it's 80% women. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. That was a great contribution. And we're now at the point of today's session where I'll ask each of our panelists to give a critical summary to conclude today. So if I can start with Bernadette.
I think this was a great conversation, and I think it's a conversation that really needs to continue, particularly around its complexity, on how we can work together to advance this and increase participation in this conversation. I think it's happening in a lot of pockets. There is the research, but how can we support each other to take this out into the mainstream for accessing all this different kind of information in a more accessible manner compared to what's in these little reports hidden somewhere in a research report, I think would be really an ask to the table, but also for others out there for us to take into our different institutions. So accessing the kind of information and the evidence that we need to be able to talk about this. And I think we also need to speak carefully about how we account for women and how we record women within these different spaces, because I think that could elicit some more complexity and more issues and more problems in terms of assumed mainstreaming or assumed equity and justice. And therefore, I think it's really important to also look at it from a legal perspective and the justice perspective, which is often forgotten because it's easy to account for, say, we have the same salaries and same retirement ages and same this, but it doesn't mean that there is inherent equity still within saying we've achieved those things. And I'll end it there.
Thank you. Eugenia?
Yeah, I'm gonna try not to repeat the same, but I was gonna do it. I mean, I agree about all those points, particularly around gender, that is not just women, of course, it's men. Not to be isolated kind of discussion, but actually mainstream it across all the different aspects of like oceans management and policy, etc. And that involves as well women participating, like actively participating in those discussions, not just assuming what they want or what they don't want. Especially because, as we said, that's going to be very context based. So it's better not to assume that. And what else can I say? I think there's a lot of work like going on already, like many women's organizations as well, that they're doing a lot of things. Data, for example, for research and policy can always be improved. But there's some already. So I think it's basically just about not assuming anything, being aware that this is an issue that is going to affect all the other aspects of any, like, again, management, policy, any research project is going to have a gender component anyway. And got to be, yeah, aware of that. That's it.
Thank you, Eugenia. And Belanle?
Thank you, everyone. I think you've all kind of said I think the most important bits really. So I think I'll just finish off by highlighting two things really. One of them is language. So I think that links to everything Benny, Gina, everyone has talked about. And when I say language, I don't mean French, English, what have you. I mean, how we the framing of, our discussion, the framing of how we present the evidence, how we present the data, how we engage with the communities. So, even when we talk about human rights and, we reference CEDAW and reference all of those treaties, but how do we frame that when we're engaging with men and women at the community levels? That's very, very important. So I think we continually have to talk about that, the language of it, and how the history impacts on the language, how the social and cultural context impacts on the language. All of that is very, very important in how we communicate. And that will then also determine potentially how much resistance we will get, I think, from the men, so to speak, when women are trying to create bigger, better spaces for themselves. So that's one thing. And then I think the final point is really for us, I think, from a very legal framing or a legal perspective specifically. What we've seen so far, at least in parts of Africa, is yes, it's amazing how we have CEDAW and we have the African protocol and we have all of these international regional obligations and sometimes even in national law very much embedded. A lot of policy talking about gender mainstreaming. You have talked a bit about that, but how does that translate at community levels? What we have found is there's still very much a gap between what the law says and what is happening. And we have to, I think, find ways to bridge those gaps. And I guess this is where the point about the women themselves, or empowering the women at those community levels to better engage with the process, is very much important. So you might have all of these beautiful policies and they do talk about them, but how does that translate in the day-to-day activities of those people in communities where they're very much having to interact with men every day? That is, just as equally as important, I think. And so I will leave it there and thank everyone for the very engaging discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Valale. And I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking all of our panelists today who have given such great insight and inspiration. And I hope we all have a takeaway point of inspiration. I know mine is that the thought of women as the change makers for the social commons is an incredibly inspiring way to be. And I think everyone's contribution on today's panel and the fact that we've all spent an hour of our day talking about this together shows that we're leading by example there. So thank you everyone for your input, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Virtual Ocean Pavilion. Thank you.